How is a transfigurative social movement like a great science fiction story? Stay with me. I know many of you are still exhausted from yesterday's awesome but early morning New Sanctuary rally in Federal Plaza. Who was there? Okay, nice. I know many of you are asking me how we can sustain our energy, our resistance, our work, our faith, and I actually got 3 separate texts from different people today saying, I'm really sorry I'm going to miss service. My body just told me I cannot come today. And many of you might just be tired of me making sci-fi connections from the pulpit. And I promise you, next time I will stick to folksy stories about my grandmother's turkey farm or something. But if there's ever going to be a Sunday when I might convince the skeptical holdouts of the magical possibilities of science fiction, it will be today, Transfiguration Sunday, when we read and remember the greatest science fiction scene within the greatest science fiction story of all time. I don't know about you, but the image of Jesus taking his brother and 2 of his besties to the top of a mountain and basically turning into a dazzling glitter bomb right in front of their eyes is hands down my favorite scene in all of Scripture. And if you have trouble thinking of our sacred texts as science fiction, consider this. The definition of science fiction is simply writings based on imagined scientific advances and major social and environmental changes, frequently portraying space and time travel. And every element of that definition is here in this amazing scene. Jesus is imbued with blinding light right before his friends' eyes. Jesus, who is leading the most important social movement of his time, Jesus is suddenly surrounded by 2 long-dead Jewish prophets who travel through space and time to be with him on the mountaintop. When I was a little Bible nerd growing up, I could not understand why all my friends were so obsessed with Star Wars when it was so obvious that Luke Skywalker had nothing on Jesus. You can applaud that. Good. We had some Bible nerds back in the day too? Okay. As for the fiction part, I know I'm surrounded by both those who will never be convinced that it did happen and those who will never be convinced that it didn't happen. And I love that. I love that we gather in this space and we have such a diversity of beliefs of what these stories actually are, what they can be. But today, I'm going to come out of the closet. Get ready, and it's not what you think. I don't know if this scene happened, but I desperately want it to have happened, because it's not only one of the coolest scenes in the Gospels, it's also the scene that proves that transfiguration is possible. It's the scene that both fantastically and concretely ties the story of Jesus' transformative social movement to the transformative social movements of the prophets who came before him. Whoever scribbled down this story for posterity knew exactly what they were doing. This mountaintop scene legitimizes Jesus' social justice ministry by tying it to the social justice ministries that have made his ministry possible. It ties Jesus' activism to the historical activism of Moses and Elijah, which gives justice-minded readers like ourselves a dazzling nudge to take up the mantle and take social justice ministry even further into the future. So how is a transfigurative social movement like a great science fiction story? To answer, I've got to bring up civil rights activist legend Ruby Sales again. And if you've been around here for the past 6 months, you know I've cited Dr. Sales repeatedly, and my excuse is that her clarity of ethical purpose, combined with her clarity of word choice, continues to astonish me. So get out your pens, because Ruby Sales just drops these things. According to Dr. Sales, a truly transfigurative societal social movement must have 3 things: hindsight, foresight, and insight. The moment I heard Dr. Sales demurely drop this wisdom, I had one of those aha moments when I'm both completely enchanted by the profundity of something and completely jealous that I'm not the one who came up with it. And I have lots of those moments around Dr. Sales. A truly transfigurative social movement must have hindsight, meaning and understanding of what has come before, what has already happened, what has already been fought for, won, lost. A truly transfigurative social movement must have foresight, meaning an understanding of what will be different, of what will be needed, of what possibilities can happen in the future. And a truly transfigurative social movement must have insight, meaning that it will take the findings from its hindsight, that it will take the predictions of its foresight, and that it will nurture a deep, intuitive understanding of the needs of the current, immediate moment. Now, Dr. Sales did not tie her formula to science fiction. So I predict I might need to beg forgiveness in the near future. That's called foresight. But I believe our sci-fi imperative for Transfiguration Sunday is all about hindsight, foresight, and insight. The hindsight comes in the appearance of long-dead social movement leaders Moses and Elijah. The foresight comes in God's declaration and Jesus' resurrection prediction. And the whole story is packed with insight into what it takes to keep a movement going. It takes looking back at where you've been. It takes looking forward to where you're going. And it takes looking deep inside your own soul and inside the souls of your neighbors to discern exactly what kind of collective resurrection is needed, moment by moment. Jesus is equipping his followers with tools to continue to move without him. And actually, even though more visible mainstream science fiction on the whole has been predominantly white, male, and straight for probably as long as it's been around, during this Black History Month, I want to acknowledge that Black-centered science fiction, like that written by Octavia Butler from our Call to Worship, that written by Samuel Delaney from our meditation quotation, and often referred to as Afrofuturism, has been focused on hindsight, foresight, and insight for as long as it's been around. As Jeremiah read from Itasha Womack's words, Afrofuturism has viewed itself as not just science fiction, but also as an imaginative, expansive way to sustain Black histories and Black futures and Black presents beyond the oppressive, white supremacist realities we've tried to make Black people believe about themselves. And Afrofuturist art has not simply been viewed as a specialized genre that's consumed by small, geeky audience. It has transformed both Black culture and Black history because it has hindsight that takes in all that has come before. It has foresight that suggests new futures in which the oppression Black people have faced for centuries is transfigured into freedom. And it has insight that works to equip Black people with real solutions that can transfigure their daily lives now. Now, I'm no expert on Afrofuturism, but when I see that it has affected the on-the-ground justice work of Martin Luther King Jr., Star Trek fan, who knew, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote science fiction himself, and so many of my friends, I see that it's not just science fiction. In a country that systematically tries to tell Black folks that they have no actual free future, Afrofuturism is a scientific formula for collective survival. And that's where I come to one more thing I think it takes to actually sustain a transfigurative social movement. Now, far be it from me to insist that Dr. Sales add a fourth ingredient to her hindsight, foresight, and insight recipe, but there's another Black woman in my life who has taught me another simple ingredient that I think will sustain the hindsight, foresight, and insight science we all crave. In a moment, you're going to hear our own Michelle Thompson. Give her a round of applause. Embarrass the heck out of her. You're going to hear Michelle sing her fabulous song, Until We All Are Free. Now, many of you have heard this song before. You've sung it with her. But today I want you to listen to her lyrics afresh. Every lyric in this song is potent. But it's the first two lines of the song that have been popping my mind and heart open in new ways this week. You'll hear Michelle sing, "We hold the keys to our very resistance. We are the collective breath of our existence. Hindsight, foresight, insight, and collective breath. That's the formula I see undergirding our current transfigurative social movements. That's the formula I think will keep us going when it feels like our bodies and our spirits are about to collapse. You can't be at everything, everywhere. You need to take a breath sometimes. And I could philosophize and theologize about this for hours, but I actually think there's one simple story to connect this sermon into Michelle singing that song. And the story's from this past month, and it can better illustrate the power and the necessity of collective breath. So, many of you know that the New Sanctuary Coalition has conducted a weekly ritual for the past few years called the Jericho Walk. And every Thursday morning, whatever group shows up silently circles 26 Federal Plaza 7 times, just like in the Bible story, and silently prays that the walls our government uses to dehumanize immigrants will crumble, just like the walls of Jericho in our Bible story. Over the past few years, as interest and energy has ebbed and flowed, the ritual has had its ups and downs. Several of you have been there, probably when there were not more than a handful of people there, and sometimes our executive director, Ravi, would even circle the building all by himself if nobody else showed up. But over the past few weeks, as Jean was detained, and then Ravi was detained, attendance at the Jericho Walk has picked back up. And I, somewhat accidentally, have started leading the walks. And the day I led my first one, I was racking my memory for how the ritual has always gone, and I felt something was missing, and I quietly asked, don't we always end the silence with like the biggest, loudest, longest scream that we can manage? And the people that were there with me leaned in and said, oh, well, yeah, we kind of stopped doing that. And so I didn't want to mess with anything. So I just went along with that. But then Jean was deported. And then when Ravi was released from detention, and in the midst of all of this emotional yo-yoing for everybody, Ravi joined us again on the Jericho Walk beat. And as he arrived at that first one, I asked Ravi if we might add the scream back in. And Ravi, who looked like he could go for a good, long, loud scream, agreed. So that Thursday, we did our silent rounds around the building. And when we came round to our final stop, I looked out at the large crowd gathered there. The large crowd who had been collecting over the last year, especially over the last month, each of us realizing that our hindsight, our foresight, and our insight implore us to consider the immigrant rights movement as a major civil rights movement of our time. And I said, okay, we haven't been doing this for the last little while, but today we're going to break this silence with the longest, loudest scream we can handle. And everyone just kind of looked at me. And then I, alone, took a breath and screamed at the top of my lungs. And then I heard Ravi take a breath. And then his scream joined mine. And then tiny Judith, if you've ever met Judith, she is very petite. She sucked in this gigantic breath the woman can breathe. And her scream joined Ravi's, which had joined mine. And then dozens of screams joined in. And I swear I could feel the walls of 26 Federal Plaza vibrating and threatening to crumble. And then I ran out of breath. And I stopped screaming for a moment. And you know what happened? The scream continued. And then I joined in again. And then I heard Ravi drop out and take his own breath, and the scream continued. And then Judith dropped out, and I heard her take another gigantic breath, and the scream continued. And then she joined in again, and we all continued to scream, each of us dropping out, taking gigantic breaths, and then joining back in again, a collective scream, but just as importantly, a collective breath. And I thought, this is the science of how transfiguration happens. This is the science of how a movement sustains itself by screaming when you can and breathing when you must. By screaming for those who must breathe and breathing ourselves back into the noise. The hindsight shows us where we've been, who has gotten us this far, how we have sacrificed, and what we have learned. The foresight shows us where we're going, who we need to welcome into the fold, how we can go further, and what the next horizon might look like. The insight shows us where our neighbors are hurting, who needs our solidarity, how to take care of one another, and what tools we have within our grasp. And the collective breath sustains it all. It tells us when we need to scream, and it promises that others will continue the noise when we need to take a breath. This science works for sustaining transfigurative social movements, and it works for sustaining transfigurative church. It works for just simply getting out of bed in the morning. So quite simply, thank you for getting out of bed this morning. Thank you for continuing to make noise. And thank you for breathing with, for, and through this ever-transfiguring sanctuary. And until we all are free, until that is a fact and not just some faraway fiction, we breathe in this sanctuary and look backward, forward, and inward for something new. And a preacher can take up a whole lot of words to say something like that. But it's the prophetic voice of an artist who can distill it down to a line that you can remember, to take with you, to hold with you when you need to take that breath before you can jump back in. So why don't we hear that song from Michelle Thompson? And I think Matt's going to help her out. Until we all are free, collective breath will sustain us. Thank you, Michelle and Matt.